This is the third time I'm giving this in this country, ever, actually, because I don't talk about this elsewhere. I have a question at the end, which is going to test whether you're paying attention to other talks at YOW, so pay attention. Okay, so this talk is about what I've learned at Spotify over the last 4 years. I've been there almost 5, actually, but it is considered a long time for a hypergrowth company. Not really that long compared to other stuff I've done. So before Spotify, I was at ThoughtWorks here in Australia for around 14 years, which is quite long. Weird. So I picked 3 insights based on all of that I think are most interesting. This is most interesting to me, not necessarily most interesting to you. That's the warning. Okay, so hopefully that there's overlap there. Okay, the first one is about aligned autonomy and how that's an ongoing struggle. The second one will be about building teams in the context of high growth. And the third one will be kind of a comparison of how I see how teams are built in consulting companies versus within this kind of product company, and the consulting companies generally seem to be better at building them fast. Okay, let's start with aligned autonomy. So what do I mean by aligned autonomy? As mentioned, I tweet a lot. This is how I talk about it. It's not I can do whatever I feel like, but rather more I feel free to act, fully engaged to achieve a greater purpose. This first part, feeling free to act and fully engage. By fully engage, I mean like you use all the skills you have, you feel like you're making contact. And you have greater purpose. So the 2 of those things are aligned autonomy. I just throw that as autonomy because I don't really think about autonomy independently, but technically those are 2 separate concepts. You may have seen this picture before. If not, it is basically putting alignment and autonomy on 2 different axes. The top right corner is what we're talking about. So aligned autonomy is high alignment and high autonomy, not any of the other squares, not really interested in them. So it seems it might be straightforward. Okay, aligned autonomy, no big deal. What's so difficult about it? In our case, there are 3 phenomena, I would say, that's occurring. One is what's called an air sandwich, hypergrowth, otherwise known as scale, and politics, otherwise known as people are involved. So, no people, no politics. That's how it goes. So, first thing, let's look at the air sandwich. So, question, does this diagram look familiar to you? At the top of your company, you have a clear vision and future direction. The day-to-day work you have, let's say it's relatively good. And I'm assuming you don't actually have problems on those 2 things, which you might have, but let's say you have that. And then you have this question mark in the middle where there's no connection. Like you just don't know what's going on. Does this sound familiar? Like who's in this? I might just question, who's in the one where there's nothing at the top? Okay, so that's another problem which I don't want to talk about because that's much more difficult to deal with. Okay, there's a book called The New How, Nilüfer Merchant. I'm just going to extract something from that. That's where the phrase air sandwich comes from. So it refers to that diagram. You have a strategy, a clear vision, future direction, and day-to-day action at the bottom, but there's nothing in the middle, hence the air sandwich. So it's a nice phrase, a way to remember this phenomena, which I kind of like. Okay, so in the diagram I showed that 2 by 2 in the corner, if you zoomed in, it says, hey, aligned autonomy. Someone says, we need to cross the river, figure out how, and then magically everyone figures out how. So that doesn't work. It's kind of like an oversimplified idea of how aligned autonomy works. Okay, the second problem that makes this difficult is hypergrowth. Well, specifically for us, it's hypergrowth. When I started, it was about 20 people or so. I'm trying to remember, Tom, when you joined. That was a while after even. But 20 people when I kind of started. By the time, now it's more like 200 people. And I'm skipping over that we essentially spawned off an entire new business unit from that initial tribe. So it's worse than that, but makes these numbers simple. So that's more than doubling every year. And I'm also including exits and backfill. So it's not like the same people just survived all the way through. We had people leaving and coming in. And inclusive of all that, it's still doubling. So it's even worse than just adding twice the people every year, which creates a lot of churn, which makes this difficult. The third thing is politics. How many people have actually watched the Spotify engineering culture videos? Okay, not that many actually. Okay, cool. So imagine you watched that video and you would have seen this picture here, which talks about the importance of scaling and needing to have trust at scale. And then Henrik talks about, and we're able to do that because there's no politics and no fear. And there's me with that question because that's nonsense. When you have human systems, any human systems, you have people. The people aren't clones. So therefore, you're going to have inevitable politics. If you didn't have different perspectives and interests, you wouldn't have politics, but you do, because we're not the same. And the idea is that you want to be curious and accept, hey, people do have different perspectives. They're not invalid, they're just different. And we don't assume bad faith. But that's not equivalent to saying there's no politics. That's always there. Okay, I'm going to talk about Mr. Rogers, because I like him. Anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. That's how I think about politics. It's just another human phenomena that we need to be comfortable talking about and dealing with so we can manage it. Trying to pretend that it doesn't exist doesn't help, which makes dealing with alignment even more difficult. Okay, so what I don't think works for alignment given those things. First is spreadsheets. I'm not going to talk more about them because they don't work. The other thing, which I think is a more common trap, is one-off speeches. We do this kind of internal newsletter thing, which we post on the toilets, which is why it's called Plan, Do, Flush. When you communicate something, people think, I just have to transmit it and then it's done, and that's not actually true. There's multiple stages that a communication needs to go through for it to be converted to action. So I talk, you have to receive, you have to understand, you have to agree, and then action occurs. Just doing the first thing doesn't work. So even what's happening right now is an example of a transmission. I don't know if you hear me or understand me or agree with me, so whether or not this will lead to anything, it's hard to tell. So if I imagine that, hey, I'm going to do this and all of a sudden we're going to align, if I assume that, that's just not going to happen and it'll fail. Okay, so what I think works for alignment, three things. What's called catch ball, then rhythm, then boundary objects. Let's start with catch ball. This is a Toyota lean metaphor. So what you want to imagine here is I have a ball, I'm going to toss it to you, you toss it back, and we have this kind of back and forth type thing. If you think, if I throw the ball to you and you don't throw it back, that's a really crappy game. And that's how you want to think about it. So alignment dialogue should look like that. It should feel like that kind of metaphor. It's just back and forth, back and forth. And it's not one way, which is like a crappy game, but also it's not good alignment dialogue if it's one way. So it's typically not, it's not typically not just one back and forth, it's multiple. Especially when it matters. So when it's difficult, it's a lot of back and forth. So if we want to create alignment, it's kind of that effect. It's a consequence of multiple forms of this back and forth, both vertically, which is the reporting line, as well as laterally, which is peer-to-peer, so across organizational boundaries. Anytime we talk about different types of planning alignment tools, they're really just different mechanisms to facilitate that phenomena. So what I mean by vertical catch ball, or example of vertical catch ball, so already mentioned, what we're doing right now doesn't get back and forth. So right now I could ask someone to ask a question right now, and there's a lot of psychological pressure there, right? You have to kind of say it in front of everyone here. You don't know them, maybe they don't like you, you look stupid, that kind of stuff. All that's happening right now, this setup is designed not to create back and forth. So if I do this and expect to get alignment, I won't, because people won't engage in the dialogue. This does. If it was just just us up here talking, we could just like have a conversation. If you don't like what I'm saying, you'd say it. Right now, it's still a lot of pressure. Okay, so if I want to create back and forth dialogue, I need to create this phenomena, not the other one. Lateral catch ball. So A cross-boundaries thing, following doesn't work. So I just had a couple quotes here or phrases. I'm sure they know we depend on them, doesn't work. This is just like wishful thinking. The other one is sort of back to spreadsheets. I marked them as a dependency in a spreadsheet that none of us regular check. That doesn't work either. I say this in kind of this sarcastic thing because it's people don't say this explicitly, which is why they think it works. Okay, following seems to work, at least better. And this is sort of, from my experience, you might have a different idea. I'd like to hear it. But this kind of pattern seems to work. Some form of the following. We've talked directly about this, so it's not like hearsay. We had a direct conversation about this. They have us in their OKRs. I say OKRs because that's our planning approach. It doesn't matter what the planning approach is. Whatever they use as a planning thing, it's explicitly in there, so I know they plan to do it. And we have a regular sync, which means we catch up and make sure any hiccups are detected. You have those three things, it seems to work. Like I can trust that, I can depend on it. Okay, second thing that works is rhythm. So well-designed meetings is kind of boring and mundane, but if you want alignment, you need to be quite good at doing this. Okay, so when we started out and we're small, we can rely on serendipity, informality, one-on-one type interactions. As we got bigger, everything needed to be more deliberate, explicit, and you're looking at multiple like end-to-end type combinations. So as an example, before I start with my example, I'm going to do a crash course in Spotify jargon and pick this up because I realize I start to jargon a lot. So I'm going to say R&D, which means research and development. That refers to the product development arm of Spotify as opposed to the business operations side. Okay. When I say squad, I mean a cross-functional team. When I say tribe, I mean a collection of squads working on a shared mission. When I say TPDI, I'm referring to the four main functions of R&D, which is technology, product, design, insights. They all have independent reporting lines. When I say a tribe leadership team, I'm referring to a leadership team that is typically consisting of leads from each of TPDI. Varies for various circumstances, but don't need to worry about that. That's sort of the level I operate at. Okay, crash course done. If you forget, that doesn't matter. But anyway, so we have this idea of a tribe R&D leads meeting, participants being the tribe leads, TPDI leads plus me, coach. The agenda was open-ended, whatever was top of mind, key events, problem solving. So it's kind of more like open-ended problem solving group with the leadership team. Worked okay. As we got larger, we added, we don't have enough information, let's add product managers, chapter leads, our engineering managers to it. Okay, still sort of worked. Then we got even bigger, then we said, okay, even they don't know everything, let's bring in some more senior individual contributors. Maybe they have something else to say. And then we noticed something, we started to complain about this, is it started to feel clunky. So the phenomena we encountered here, is how I try to describe it. If you could imagine that green circle in the middle is the level of depth you need to get to in order to have the actual conversation. And those arrows coming from the people is how far the discussion actually goes. That's the phenomenon we saw. It's like the more people you had, you couldn't get to the depth necessary, so the meeting felt just doesn't work. I kind of say if you have enough people, you will end, like you'll introduce yourselves and then the meeting's over, which it kind of doesn't work because why are we introducing ourselves and having a scheduled meeting for that? Okay, so we changed that. So move from open-ended problem solving, split that meeting into 3 separate meetings, R&D leads, tribe leads, squad delivery syncs, general concept, make the group smaller, make the agenda more focused. Now you can actually get to the center of the discussion. What happened then is that the meeting started to feel redundant. It's like, hey, wait, I'm talking about the same thing in multiple things. We're getting to the depth, but it seems like we're just talking about it again and again. So maybe I need to change this as well. So we shifted that again. So instead of what I had before, we shifted back to almost like the tribe leads one ended up being almost like the original one when we were much smaller. Shifted from this open-ended thing to more delivery-focused OKR sync, and then we had like squad level lead syncs to deal with that. So that created less redundancy, more focused agenda. The general thing I want to convey here is this: we have this kind of iterative design of meetings that is just ongoing, and really I'm simplifying it because it doesn't stop. It just keeps happening where we're adjusting it all the time. There is this balancing act that's occurring though, where you have this, have to reduce the amount of people so I can get to depth. But I also need to watch out for perspectives. Like, why did we add the people in the first place? Is because we were missing perspectives. And if you didn't have enough perspectives in the meeting, you start missing problems. Like, we couldn't see everything. So you're always balancing how many people do I have in the meeting, as well as do I have enough perspectives to actually detect the problem. Again, otherwise we're wasting time. Okay, so that's rhythm. The last one here is boundary objects. Does anyone know who this is? Yeah, one person, of course, because you hang out a lot. Brian Merrick. This is where I learned the concept of boundary object from. This comes from social science, refers to an object, physical or mental, that allows groups with different goals to coordinate their actions. It's essentially something that we can use to talk. Okay. From ThoughtWorks. This is a set of images we used a lot. I'm not sure whether that was actually developed here or in London. But general idea, if you can imagine, we're talking, we say we agree, but in our heads, we're actually thinking about something else. So it's all false agreement. It's like we're deluded into thinking we agree. Until we represent what we're thinking in some shared model or map, we won't detect the error. But once we do, we can correct that, and all of a sudden, when we agree, we can actually trust that agreement. It's not fake. Okay, does that make sense? So, shared model or boundary object facilitates real over fake alignment. So this is back to why I'm talking about this is to create alignment. Is it has to be real alignment, not phony alignment. So I'm going to run through very quickly some shared models that we used in one tribe, just to give you a flavor of what these sort of things look like. One is metaphors. This is one about a helicopter and trying to climb up a mountain, and then we were saying we can use the helicopter to make jumps, but the helicopter can only go so high, and now we have to climb, blah, blah, blah. You don't really need to know what this refers to. It's just because it's weird. I don't know how many people actually connected with this one. It was kind of neat. Okay, so then we tried this thing, flywheel. Everybody in every tech company likes to do flywheels, I think, because Amazon did it. This is actually Amazon's flywheel. So you have to imagine replacing it with what the Spotify flywheels are, which I'm not comfortable sharing publicly because they are like business strategy stuff. But yeah, so this kind of thing of what works here. We also use this thing called a design hierarchy of needs. Basically, this is based off of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so a psychological concept. Like when you are building a product, you're moving your way up this hierarchy. Like if the thing doesn't basically work, don't worry about super features, like build your way up. So we had this kind of concept. The things that I like the most, these things like process journey maps is probably one of the more recent ones. Okay, let's look at the end-to-end operator, consumer, whatever experience, and then say, hey, do we satisfy that? Can someone do the complete job? I always like this. And I think this is the final one. Actually, no, this is not the final one. System context diagrams. Simon Brown's going to talk about this in his thing. So this is from the C4 model. It's just a diagram that shows, hey, here's a high-level view of what the system is, what it interacts with, and key things. The only important point here, because I had to blank out everything else, is the brain, because it's machine learning. So therefore, it must be good. Okay, so, and yeah, I kind of added this one because I'm going to lead to why later. This is what I actually like to do myself to think through things. I like cause-effect diagrams, relatively complex cause-effect diagrams, to get my head around what's going on. What I have found, though, is nobody else seems to like using these. So it doesn't work for anyone else. It's not necessarily that effective as a boundary object because it doesn't facilitate the dialogue. And that I wanted to put this up there because the point is that you're doing this to facilitate the dialogue. That's the point. If the model's too simple when you're doing that, you don't facilitate the right dialogue because it's too simplified. We get fake agreement. But if it's too fancy, it's confusing and you don't have dialogue because they don't know what you're talking about. So there's always this balancing act between like simpler or fancier depending on the audience and what is necessary to facilitate that dialogue. So whatever works is the right model or map. And what works changes over time. Those things that I showed probably evolved over, I don't know, multiple years, like just different variants of what seemed to connect at the time. And then we just kept shifting it. So aligned autonomy is an ongoing struggle because air sandwich hypergrowth politics and the things I think were catchball rhythm boundary objects. Let's shift to building teams in the context of high growth. What do I mean by high growth? Already mentioned, we more than double every year, including exits and backfill. What's so hard about it? Two things. You can't assume stable teams, and you can't rely on a cultural osmosis. First one is straightforward, so I'm not going to talk about it. Like if you can imagine just like hordes of people showing up all the time, the teams don't stay stable because you're trying to absorb too many things. There's nothing really fancy about that. The more interesting one, I think, is what happens with cultural osmosis. So you have a phenomena where the new people outnumber the veterans. So the default culture, if you think, hey, what is the company culture? It's not what was already there. It's what the people bring, right? Because they outnumber you. This is if you don't do anything. So default culture becomes whatever new people bring with them. So let's say, given that context, what I don't think works, and this is kind of like a anti-pattern, whatever, the presumptive team splits, what I'll call that. People will say things like, this will eventually be a separate team, so we might as well split it now. Or some variant of, we need to split this team because teams should not have more than N numbers or members, like it could be 9 or 5, or I don't care what you put up, but you're kind of going off some arbitrary rule rather than watching what's going on. Okay, what seems to happen when you do that, and this has happened at least 2 times to me, the team will inevitably end up with either unclear mission or missing skills because it was split too early. They'll fill the time with low-value activity, they get bored, and they disengage or quit. Right? So that's the problem. So what I do think works then are 3 things. Let's start with this one, structure follows strategy. Alfred D. Chandler used to be a Harvard Business School professor, I believe. And he said something called, unless structure follows strategy, inefficiency results. I just call that structure should follow strategy. And I also say that structure should be stable where strategy is stable, and it should be flexible where strategy is volatile. I wonder should I pause for people to take pictures? You know, just burst fire. As an example, okay, so reminder of Spotify jargon again, because I'm going to kind of get into it. Squad is a cross-functional team. Tribe is a collection of squads working on a shared mission. So for us, for my area, the area I work with, the tribe mission is much more stable than the squad mission. Okay? Therefore, if we follow that rule, the tribe should be more stable than the squads, right? Because then now that it's consistent with the strategy or the situation, I'm going to make the structure match what the strategy is. Okay? Which means that things like identity, swag, events, whatever, you're going to emphasize tribe identity over squad identity. Now, this is kind of unconventional advice. Most people talk about, hey, the team's the first thing, blah, 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 all this thing. But in this circumstance, it would be inconsistent and incongruent with the overall strategy. It's like you're not paying attention to what's going on. Okay? And also encourage movement and collaboration on squads. So again, you're not attached to the squad. You're thinking more of this broader idea. Okay? My point here is not that tribes, like whatever your version of tribes, should be more stable than squads as a general rule. It's more that this is designed explicitly, right? So you're paying attention to what the strategy is, you modify the structure to match it. If the strategy changes, so does the structure. When people talk about Conway's Law, which I stopped talking about because everyone talks about it, that's what they're saying. Okay. Organic org design. So this is how I approach splitting squads, tribes, etc. It doesn't really matter what the scale is really. So first thing, you wait for seams to appear. So that's why I say clunky, meetings get clunky and that sort of thing. So you're looking at clunkiness in communication flow, interaction patterns, especially in meetings. Then you nudge things apart. So, oh, okay, maybe a subgroup of people, they have a slightly separate rhythm and events. They go to a meeting that not everyone attends. There's some other things that are going on. Nothing formal. We're just nudging things apart. Over time, they'll notice that, hey, I stop interacting so much with the other people in the team anyway, and we just formalize that. So if this is done correctly, it's almost like an acknowledgement or a non-event. Everyone thinks they'll say things like, we finally split this team. Like, we should have split this team a long time ago. Obviously, this should be a separate organization. I don't know why we didn't do it earlier. So my kind of target here is almost like you're splitting just a little too late. And that's the feeling, right? Which means that it's relatively straightforward. Okay, so that's the idea. Wait for teams to appear, nudge teams apart, formalize the split. Picture taken. Okay, cool. Deliberate culture. I'm going to reference Edgar Schein. This is how I think about organizational culture. I think this is like standard MBA book, 5th edition, recently published. 3 levels of culture. Artifacts, espoused. Artifacts are things you see. Actually, if you think like an archaeologist, stuff that's left behind by a culture. 2, espoused beliefs and values. It just means like, if I say, hey, what are your beliefs and values? What do you say or what do you publish? And 3 is basic underlying assumptions. Basic underlying assumptions means beliefs at the level of do you believe in gravity kind of things. Okay, so if someone challenges the basic underlying assumptions, your interpretation or your response is that they're insane. Okay, so like it's not like, oh, I believe this, you believe that. No, it's like, you believe you can fly? Okay, someone get that person help. Okay, so there is no such thing as universal bad culture, but a culture can be incompatible with the strategy. And by strategy, I'm going to refer to Richard Rummelt, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, who has a strategy kernel, which includes 3 things: a diagnosis, so an assessment of what the situation is, a guiding policy, which are essentially beliefs, principles, and a set of coherent actions. Now, if you have an incompatible culture, like a culture that's incompatible with strategy, what you'll notice is that you can't accept the diagnosis. So you can't believe oh, this is what's going on. You can't believe it. 2, you can't accept the guiding principle. So all the things that we need to do to respond to this situation, you can't believe those things. And therefore, you won't engage in coherent action because it all sounds like nonsense to you. Okay? I'm sure people can think of various current phenomena where this is happening. Okay, so if you're not deliberate about culture, you will have random strategic problems, right? So I'll go, hey, why are people doing these weird stuff? Like, do they not know the diagnosis? Do they not know the stuff? It's just because they can't accept those things, and it lends to strategic problems. I would say when people say culture eats strategy for breakfast, this is the phenomena they're talking about, right? So it's not just a thing. It's that the culture is undermining the ability for you to actually engage in strategy. So default culture becomes whatever new people bring with them, unless you are much more deliberate about occupying that space. So the way I see it is someone new shows up. I'll talk about this later. People show up and they don't see anything there. So they have no guidance or clarity around what how we work is in the new place. So they'll just default to what they bring with them. If you occupy that space with something, they'll kind of go, oh, I guess that's how we're supposed to do things, and they'll take that instead, or that's the idea. Now, how you occupy that space, I'm going to borrow from this systems leadership. This is actually randomly from some people from Rio Tinto. So weird. But 3 tools for deliberate culture. 1, role modeling. So people who are influential need to be explicitly role modeling behavior that is sort of congruent with the things you want to have in play. Again, someone shows up, they look at influential people, say, I guess I'm supposed to be like that because they're influential, they're doing those things, that's what should be expected. 2, systems, processes, tools, whatever, all the stuff consistent with how you think things should be. And then symbols. Symbols just refers to propaganda, really. Like you're wearing T-shirts that say something or whatever, but it's propaganda. This is kind of in order of priority too, like role modeling is more effective than systems, and systems are more effective than symbols. But if you want to be deliberate, you fill all of that. Like there's no, it's not open-ended. Okay, so building teams in the context of high growth requires different assumptions. Because you can't assume stable teams, you can't rely on cultural osmosis. Therefore, you do certain things: structure follows strategy, organic org design, deliberate culture. Okay, number 3, consulting companies are better at building high-performing teams fast. How many people work for consulting companies? Who doesn't? Everyone else? I guess, of course, right? It's a trick question. Trick question. Maybe you're in like some kind of pseudo half-half. I don't know. Okay, so why are consulting companies faster at building teams? Yeah, consultants, you can challenge me on this because I'm also giving an idealized version of a consulting company, not the actual ones. Okay, so you have no choice and no time. If you are a consulting company, you are billing by the hour, unless you're really sophisticated and you can bill on something else, but mostly you're billing by the hour. So clients don't want to pay for setup time. So you say, oh, I need to be paid for building a team from scratch, and they say, yeah, that's very funny. How about you do that and then show up? Okay, so therefore, you need to get fast at building high-performing teams because clients not going to pay for it. You want to make money. You get good at this. Okay, this of course, I'm assuming you are a good consulting company. If you're crappy, you just lose money and then, whatever. But we don't need to learn from them. Okay, so what I think matters to build high-performing teams fast based on my experiences doing that, 3 things: same training, same assumptions, focus on craft, not mission, and practice. Okay, first thing. If you have the same assumptions about how things work, you can hit the ground running very quickly because you don't have to negotiate like roles, rhythms, rituals. We just all have the same view of things, so you just go, right? We don't have to talk about it. That's the idea. So when I started at ThoughtWorks, I don't know who you are, but I can assume you're into extreme programming, Martin Fowler. It's like easy, right? So straightforward. So, yeah, right? I don't know if that's still the case. Maybe it is. I don't know. But that was the case. So it was kind of funny. Like, okay, that kind of worked. Okay, so how does that manifest? Is you could be more particular in hiring, right? So in the sense that I'd select people that have the exact same interests, like same backgrounds. I'm a little wary of this because I'm wary that, hey, we're probably going to hire people that just end up being from the same actual community. So that there's some diversity inclusion issues here. So I'm a little wary of this. I'm still okay with saying, let's take a look at our criteria and certain things, but I'm a little wary of this one. Alternatively, and this happened after I joined, so I've never gone through this myself, but there's a thing that was called ThoughtWorks University. It was effectively 5 weeks. I think they still go there, but they went to India and worked on stuff there. The point of this was to start establishing a baseline in terms of values, practices, and principles, hearing common stories, mythology, that kind of stuff. And it was creating what I mentioned before, right? It role models behavior. You get, like, how does this system work? All the propaganda, etc. Okay? And then that meant that when they actually went out there into the field, you had that shared experience, and it's much more likely you can get up to speed much more quickly. Okay, so this is essentially much more involved onboarding. So I would say in general, this is like the 4 to 6 week mark. I am aware that Facebook does something like this. I've never gone through it, so I don't know. I'm not sure even if it creates the same effect, but I like that idea. So you have much more involved onboarding. That creates the common baseline. So it's like a boot camp. Okay. The other thing is to focus on craft, not mission. So John Doerr via Marty Kagan. So I could not find any reference from John Doerr actually saying this, but Marty Kagan says he said it. But he said, we need teams of missionaries, not teams of mercenaries. And this refers to initial startup teams. When I hear this, I think of stuff like this. So actual mercenaries killing kids because they have no medical training, which I don't like. That's bad. So, and I kind of interpret this in general, that you can be very enthusiastic about purpose, but it doesn't compensate for lack of skill, right? That's not enough. Honestly, I prefer teams of competent professionals focused on improving their craft over teams of enthusiastic novices focused on any particular mission. There's a kind of a phenomena that you see sometimes, not always the case, but a lot of times with NGOs where it's almost like excuses bad practice because you're exploiting the fact that everyone wants to believe, which is it's not a nice way to do things. Okay, granted, skilled craft doesn't excuse participation in unethical missions. Cough, cough, McKinsey. okay? Why does this happen with consultants more likely? Why? Because I think consultants focus on craft, or it's easier to focus on craft more, because clients are typically not that interesting. I apologize to anyone who has higher content, or sort of the secret's out is you're not that interesting. That's not that surprising. Okay, so and I had this interesting phenomena. I had a friend, we used to work together, and he was observing that the more interesting the client, the less time he would spend on open source projects, and the more interesting, so you could tell how interesting the client he was working with just by looking how much time he spent on open source. So it was a kind of a funny little proxy, and that was the phenomena. So here are some sessions that like we did that I think that worked. So they're kind of interesting. So one brown bag session. So this was facilitating workshops or presentations. This is either at site or on site at the client or back at our own office. And you just talk about stuff. This is pretty cool. We also did hack nights. So you met up after work on personal and open source projects and just work together on it. Now, it's kind of a weird thing. Like this was always after work because you, again, billed by the hour, so you couldn't do it at the client. But people would do this because they were bored. Okay, this is still happening. Notice this thing, this progressive hack night happening at the ThoughtWorks in New York. So it's still going, which is kind of cool. Okay, the other thing was coding dojos. So I don't know how many people have heard of coding dojos. Okay, I almost feel like this is getting more rare now. But the idea is like I'd be up here and I'd have someone else with me and we'd be demonstrating how we were solving a problem. And that's, again, we're conveying craft by showing. There's also a style that I always liked, which was called the Randori style. So like every 5 minutes, one person would rotate out. So like everyone would kind of come through here, which was very dynamic. And usually audience participation, so people would be yelling in the crowd, you know, that algorithm sucks, use this one instead. Or, you know, tabs, not spaces, or something. Which is always very funny to do stuff like that. And then mob code review. So we used to do this a lot with reviewing submissions. The key thing, though, was not like, hey, we had to do this thing. It's that it was a way for us to start establishing a standard taste. So our design taste starts to come together because we're calibrating it by engaging ourselves a lot more often in these sort of things. And I think that was quite effective. And I don't mean like normalizing it so it becomes lowest common denominator, but it raises the bar to whoever like the best person is. Okay, now the question for me though is, because I no longer work for a consulting company, how should this happen when the work is interesting? Right? It's not always the case, but I think in Spotify, most people are, you know, they want to be there. It's not just a client in the same sense. So how does this work? I'm not sure, like, could we still have these extracurricular things, like outside of work hours? I'm not so sure about that. Also, you know, work-life balance, that sort of thing. But there is this thing where practice is very different from working. If you're working, you're trying to get the job done. When you're practicing, you're trying to develop a skill. Those are not necessarily compatible. So I'm not sure. The other thing is, can you modify the work to accommodate this in a more inline setting? So like more regular on-the-job training, you know, learn a thing, use it immediately, that kind of stuff. I'm not sure. This is something, unless something else pops up, because I always get surprised with some other random thing, but this is something I'd like to explore next year to work out. How do we execute that phenomena in a product company setting? Okay, so last thing here, practicing teaming and reteaming. Phenomena that occurs. So typical lifetime of a team in a consulting company is weeks to months, because that's how much a client is willing to pay before they start questioning whether they have enough budget to pay for the consultants. Okay, so product company, on the other hand, even with hypergrowth, I would say multiple quarters is a relatively good guess for how long a team might last. So you can rely on that. As you notice, the right side is much bigger than the left side. And you have this phenomena. How many people have seen this graph before? So this is sort of how we talked about, this is kind of like a justification for faster iteration, continuous integration, that sort of stuff. The phrase, kind of extreme programming thing was, if it hurts, do it more often, right? Because if you do it more often, you learn why it hurts. You just can't accept that it's still hurting, so you deal with the problem. And then over time, it hurts less and you become more capable. The same thing applies to teaming. If you practice forming and deforming and forming and deforming, yeah, that's kind of funny. I'll use that. Teams, you will also learn how that works. You get good at it. Heidi Helfland talked about her experience in this book called Dynamic Teaming. Also, I think there's a chapter, she interviewed some people from Spotify about it, but this is a thing to think about. This could mean as well, like even though I talked about structure follows strategy, where I could say, I'm going to do this reteaming purely from a practice thing to develop a capability to be able to respond to an unanticipated event. Okay, so consulting companies are better at building high-performing teams fast because they don't have a choice, because there's no time. Same training, same assumptions, focus on craft, practice teaming and reteaming. And non-consulting companies can do these things too. Otherwise, this would be limited advice because there aren't that many consulting companies. Okay, so 3 insights. So get your cameras ready. Okay, the first one, align autonomy is an ongoing struggle because the air sandwich hypergrowth politics. I'll use you as the judgment. So therefore, you have 3 things: catch, ball, rhythm, boundary objects. Also, these slides will be shared. So you're really wasting your time now. So, okay, so building teams in the context of high growth requires different assumptions because you can't assume stable teams. You can't rely on cultural osmosis. And therefore, structure should follow strategy, organic org design, deliberate culture. I should say some of these things, I think you have to deal with it slightly differently when you're not growing very quickly, but I would say still important or useful things to do. You can get away with not doing it though. And 3, consulting companies are better at building high-performing teams fast because they don't have a choice. And I just mentioned this, so I won't repeat it. These are the 5 books that I referenced here, mostly closer to the end. They're very good, so I will suggest you take a look at them. And that sort of gives a sense of how I think through things. So questions, ideas, advice. I am very curious, like if you think you would respond to this situation differently. So you can challenge me back and forth, right?